Actors can do some really incredible things. I mean, they can cry on command, they can distort their bodies to fit the role that they're playing. It's just amazing the talent that they have. But this time in particular, I want to talk about when there was just a pause. And not the kind that you would see in a script, but the kind that was actually built for applause, a real life pause moment. During the 79th BAFTA Awards, a racial slur was shouted from the audience while presenters were on stage. And you could feel the air change. The word it landed as it normally does. And then came this explanation. The person who shouted it has Tourette syndrome, and that vocal tick was involuntary. And just like that, the room and the internet split because two things were true in the same moment. The tick was involuntary, but the harm was not. So, what do we do with that? And before we answer that, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Dr. James Bell III, and I spend my work looking at how systems and policies and institutions create both opportunity and harm, often at the same time. My focus is typically on equity. I live and breathe public health, but it's really understanding how layered identities interact with the structures around them. So when an act has no malicious intent but produces real harm, what do we do? The host of the award show, Alan Cummings, he addressed it live, and the BBC later apologized for airing it without editing. That's important. We're going to come back to that. But the deeper tension wasn't about the broadcast protocol, it was about values. Because are we defending disability or are we defending people harmed by racial violence? The bigger question is, why do we feel the pressure to choose? Intent asks us, did they mean it? Whereas impact asks, what did it do? And we're often more comfortable debating intent rather than sitting with impact because intent feels fair, but impact feels uncomfortable. But impact is where the body lives, and impact is where history lives. Now, here's my mature framing because I had to sit and think about this before I hit record. Intent it will always explain your behavior. Impact will measure the harm. Tourette syndrome is neurological, and vocal tics can include socially inappropriate language. This is not a character flaw. Also true, racial slurs carry centuries of violence. They can activate memories, fear, lived experiences, and acknowledging one does not cancel the other. And this is where a lesson that I once received becomes so critical. If the harm was imposed in public, the apology should be as well. Public harm requires a public acknowledgement. And this is not to punish someone for a disability, it's not to perform outrage, but to repair the rupture in the space. Silence after a public harm, it feels like you're dismissing it. But public acknowledgement says we saw it, we understand the weight of it, and we care enough to respond. This moment isn't really about one award show. It's about design. When we build public systems, whether it's a broadcast like this example, workplaces, classrooms, we are responsible for anticipating complexity. Tourette syndrome is not new. Live television is not new. Editing tools are not new. So let's deepen that complexity just a bit. So the racial slur remained in the broadcast, but when a filmmaker makes an intentional statement like Free Palestine, it got edited out. Now we're no longer just discussing intent versus impact. We're discussing editorial judgment. Because when one statement is removed and another is left in, even on delay, that's not accidental. That's you actually making a decision about your values. Because censorship decisions are going to reveal what institutions believe audiences should or should not hear. So the real question becomes, how do institutions plan for foreseeable tension? Can we hold disability justice and racial justice at the same time? Because they are not opposites. They actually share a common value, and that value being dignity. The individual did not choose the tick, but the audience did not choose the harm. But institutions choose the response. And that choice determines whether you are going to erode trust or if you're going to restore it. So if your framework forces you to pick a side between compassion for disability and compassion for racial harm, then perhaps the framework is too small. Complex systems require complex thinking, but there's another layer here, and it's one that I think we often avoid, and that's intersectionality. And I want to quickly explain what it is because I often hear it used incorrectly. But this framework that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw reminds us that systems of oppression do not operate independently. Race, disability, class, gender, they all intersect. And in this moment, disability and race literally collided in public. If we only center disability, we risk minimizing racial harm. If we only center race, we risk stigmatizing disability. And so intersectionality demands that we hold both. It requires us to resist the simplicity of choosing one marginalized identity over another. And here's the harder truth: some people in that room may have been both Black and disabled, which means the harm and the defense may have lived in the same body. That's what complexity looks like. So the real leadership question becomes, can our institutions respond in ways that acknowledge layered identities without flattening anyone into a single issue? Again, the individual did not choose the tick, and the audience did not choose the harm. Institutions choose the response. And that choice determines whether you're going to preserve dignity or if you're going to apply it selectively. I think about it this way: you should not have to choose between disability justice and racial justice. Justice that has to compete is not justice, that is hierarchy. You have disability, race, politics, free expression, all colliding in one award ceremony. But are we consistent in how we apply harm mitigation? Are we transparent about what gets edited and why? And are we centering dignity equally across identities? Because when institutions selectively intervene, trust becomes more fragile. And you already know, once trust is fractured, it's pretty damn difficult to restore it. I'm not trying to attack the BBC. I'm also not defending the BBC. I'm just interrogating design and consistency. When intent and impact collide, it is okay to pause. We don't have to rush to defend, we don't have to rush to condemn, but you should be asking who experienced the harm. You should be asking who is vulnerable here. What type of acknowledgement is required? Because both of these things can be true. Holding both truths does not absolve responsibility or accountability. It's about holding the nuance. It's not about excusing anyone. You may be confused to think holding both truths as passive. It's actually an invitation to act responsibly within your sphere of influence. And so the choice isn't whether harm exists, because it always will. The choice is how we respond publicly and thoughtfully when it does. Imagine a person who experienced the harm. Imagine a person who didn't choose that tick. Both are real and both deserve our attention. We get really comfortable asking who's to blame, but no one takes the time to ask what is required of us now. Equity is not about allocating blame, it's about the intentionality and designing our response. When harm happens, the question isn't simply who caused it. We always have to point back to accountability and what does repair require of us. When harm happens in public, responsibility does not simply disappear because intent is complicated. Impact still exists. Institutions are still making a choice. And ultimately, we are also shaping the culture at the same time. My biggest issue with situations like this is that blame will do nothing more than narrow the moment to a villain. But where is the accountability? Accountability points back to what I mentioned earlier about how when harm is public, the repair has to be public as well. When you're making editorial choices, you are communicating your values. And when identities start to intersect, those responses, they have to be layered. And we don't have the option to be selective. My goal for us is that we actually shift from reaction to responsibility because equity requires this of us. And so just thanks for tuning in and for sitting with complexity. We have to think more critically about the moments that challenge us and the truths that we hold simultaneously. And it turns out that you don't always have to choose a side. Sometimes the braver choice is actually to hold both truths, to name them, and then to act with care and accountability. So I want you all to stay reflective and stay courageous. This has been Equity Matters because equity always matters, especially when the truths that we need to hold aren't easy.